Another key event in African American historiography is Reconstruction, the period of approximately 1865 to 1877, following the American Civil War, in which federal troops stationed in states that had been in rebellion against the United States basically ensured that African Americans were able to exercise their rights as now free people. And you can kind of see a celebration of that in this image here from Harper's Weekly, as I said, a journal of civilization, in which you see this older African American man followed by an African American soldier being able to vote. Right? This time period led, for example, to large numbers of African American men. Women were still kind of kept out of politics, unfortunately, to be able to serve in state legislatures, for example. Now, what happens though is, of course, Reconstruction ends, the federal troops are withdrawn, and you have essentially the establishment of a Jim Crow society in which African Americans are, even though on paper they have certain rights, such as the right to vote, in practice, those rights are denied them. And there's this question, of course, why did this happen? Right? Why did this happen? Now, one answer is given in this cartoon by Thomas Nast. Now, I want to stress, I think it's easy to misunderstand cartoons, especially when they're taken out of their historical context. So let me give you some context. Nast was a Northern progressive. He very much had a vision of the world, you can see in his other comics, in which he believed all people, all races could come together. So he's not a racist in that sense, right? He is someone who believes very strongly that the war was in a large part about slavery, about ending slavery, and that not only should slavery be ended, but that African Americans should enjoy equality. From his perspective, the reason Reconstruction fails is because of the assertion of white supremacy, here represented by a member of the Ku Klux Klan and this thing called the White League, right? They are working together to keep down African American people. And notice they're armed. So this is being put down, right? The African American attempts to obtain equality is being put down violently. And it's important to stress here, again, this is a violent comic, but you have the African Americans being terrorized. In the background, you have a lynching that's being criticized. You have a school book here, and you have a schoolhouse that's been burnt. African Americans, after the Civil War, had a great demand, a great desire for learning, realizing that that was a pathway to achieve not only full political equality and to exercise those rights, but also economic equality. And through things like education, African Americans are able to rise in society, and that challenged the ideas of white supremacy. Remember, there's this argument that African Americans are inferior, being of African descent, they're different, and that difference is connected to their inferiority. And they are therefore, when they're trying to better themselves, or however you want to say it, they're threatening the natural order of things, and violence needs to be used to put that down. And that's unfortunately basically what happened. And I think Nast in that sense is accurate in his understanding of what's happening. So in the historiography, an African American historiography, right, you have this argument about why Reconstruction failed. Why doesn't it continue? It's eventually because the federal government withdraws troops, basically abandons African Americans, and then whites believing in white supremacy, not all whites, but the large number who did believe in white supremacy, are going to use violence to come in and take over, basically. Now, that's not the only argument why it failed. there's a very important scholar named William Dunning. So important, there's something called the Dunning School. And here it doesn't mean like a building where people studied. The Dunning School, it refers to kind of a understanding of history, in this case of Southern history. And in 1901, Dunning wrote an article, and he included this quote in it. This was the ultimate root of the trouble in the South had been not the institution of slavery, that's not the problem, but the coexistence in one society of two races so distinct in characteristics as to render coalescence impossible. So white people and black people are so different, we can't really coalesce together into one society. That slavery had been a modus vivendi, that just means a way of living together, through which social life was possible, and that after its disappearance, its place must be taken by some set of conditions which, if more humane and beneficent in accidents, must in essence express the same fact of racial inequality. Now, this is maybe you're having a little trouble understanding what Dunning is saying here, because basically he's trying to say really terrible things in a way that sounds smart and polite. But what he's arguing is people of African descent and people of European descent are very different. People of African descent are not as good, basically, are inferior to people of European descent. And because of that inequality, we can't really live together in a society as equals because we're not equal. And therefore, it was necessary to have some sort of society in which the inferior was subject to the superior. So before the Civil War, that was slavery. After the Civil War, with the Reconstruction, with the failure of Reconstruction, which was doomed to fail, it was inevitable to fail. It would definitely fail from Dunning's view because it ignored the fact that blacks and whites are not equal. Right? So what that means then is that the new society, the Jim Crow society, is fine. It's right. It represents the natural order. So you have these two very different understandings of why Reconstruction failed. One is Nass's view, which is it failed because of the willingness of many whites to use violence to try and restrain the efforts of African Americans to rise in society. And then you have Dunning's view, which says, no, it was destined to fail because blacks and whites are inherently racially different. People of European descent are superior, and people who are of African descent are inferior, and this is just the way we have to live together. There's a lot of things to say about this. It's just really wrong, and I'll just leave it at that so we can keep going. But it's important to understand, Dunning was a respected figure in the world of American history. I'm not saying everyone agreed with him. They didn't. But he was a respected figure. I want to stress, this wasn't some guy on the margins. The Atlantic Monthly was a reputable journal. So if you're a historian interested in the issues of African American history, this is the kind of person you have to deal with. Right? This is the kind of person you're going to have to argue with. And one person who's going to argue with Dunning was W.E.B. Dubois. Dubois is a fascinating person, right? You are probably familiar with him as a civil rights activist, and that was definitely true. You may not know, though, he has a history background. But he was born in Massachusetts. He would go to Tennessee to study, and then eventually would receive a PhD from Harvard. And he became the first African American to earn a doctorate in history. Right, so Du Bois is not simply a civil rights activist. He was also a serious historian. Those two things, of course, are not mutually exclusive. They can go together just fine. Now, Du Bois is very interesting. He has this idea of what he calls double consciousness. And this goes back to that theme I talked about previously, that on one side, an African American is an American and feels like, in a sense, a part of American society, right? But the other side is kind of excluded from that society and is a sense, okay, I'm somewhat different. So I'm an American in some ways, but not quite American like other Americans in other ways, or at least I'm not being recognized as a full American. So there's this kind of duo sense of belonging and yet not belonging. Right? Like I said, anyone who's kind of a minority, I think, is going to kind of feel this. But especially for African Americans, because of the particularly difficult history they faced, it's even deeper. That we belong to this country, but in a sense, we don't belong to this country. And it's especially hard to feel like you belong to the country when you have people like Dunning saying how inferior you are. Right? You're so inferior that you had to either be enslaved or repressed. Now, a very important thing that Du Bois did early on, and this connects him to the civil rights movement, is he was hired basically by a university in Philadelphia to do surveys, to do research. So he went around to several thousand, I believe, African-American households and asked them questions. Tried to get lots of data about them. You know, questions like, you know, where are you employed? What is your job? You know, how long have you lived here? Have you ever been to prison? If so, for what? And what he found turned the argument made by segregationists, by supporters of Jim Crow, on their head. What do I mean by that? People who argued that African Americans were inferior would say things like, well, African Americans have higher rates of unemployment. African Americans have higher rates of incarceration. That means that they're racially inferior. That's why we have to have Jim Crow. That's why we have to have segregation. Because these people are racially inferior. We got to kind of protect the rest of society from them. Now, Du Bois, using the data he got, turned this on its head. He said, well, the reason that African Americans have higher rates of unemployment is they are excluded because of segregation from a lot of jobs. Right? If you have less job opportunities because you're black, of course you're going to have higher, then black people will have higher rates of unemployment because they have less opportunities for jobs. And in this time period, there were unions, right? There would be certain jobs that most of the people who did them belonged to unions, but the unions only allowed white members, and these were what were called closed shops. You could not work in a particular factory or in a particular occupation unless you were a member of the union, and only white people could join the union. Well, that has nothing to do with racial inferiority, of course. That has to do with segregation, right? So he flips it on its head. And of course, people who are unemployed and who can't find jobs are naturally going to be more likely to commit crime. So Du Bois argues based on this data that problems in the black community were the result of segregation, not why it was necessary. Right? People who believed in white superiority were arguing because African Americans are racially inferior, we have to segregate them to protect ourselves and the rest of society from them. And Du Bois says, no, all these things that you say are inferior about African Americans has nothing to do with them being African Americans. It has to do with the suffering, the prejudice that they suffer and the segregation that they suffer. So Du Bois, you can see, is using scholarship to deal with the racist systems in the United States and to challenge them. And he, as a historian, knows how historical narratives are used to justify segregation and slavery. We just saw Dunning doing that. And Dunning was not the only one. I want to stress, Dunning was popular. I don't want people to think that I just picked Dunning out of some, off the margins as like some nut. He was considered a serious historian. And Du Bois has to figure out how do you deal with that? How do you challenge that? And in 1935, Du Bois publishes a massive book called Black Reconstruction in America, in which he argues, based on excellent historical analysis of primary sources, how the Nast understanding of Reconstruction is more accurate. That Reconstruction was not bad, Reconstruction was going well, but because it threatened notions of white supremacy, violence was used to crush it. Now, that book is hundreds of pages long, but for this section, you are required to read the paper it was based on. Du Bois presented his paper to the American Historical Association, and it contains the basic argument. So you'll read how Du Bois uses historical documentation and analysis and historical arguments to challenge racist ideas of Reconstruction. So I think it's very interesting. You can see, right, how the difficult situation African Americans are in is shaping that historiography. Oops. Oh, my apologies. So you can see here, there's a strong connection between power and history. Systems of power that can be quite unjust, like white supremacy, are based upon a particular understanding of history. And therefore, to overcome that understanding of history, or that power, you need to develop a more accurate understanding of history, which emphasizes how this is all incorrect. This is wrong. This isn't about racial this isn't that somehow African Americans are inferior. They're not. This has to do with people wanting to maintain their power. Now, to continue with another very important African-American historian, a man named Carter Woodson. Carter Woodson is often considered the father of Black history. He actually started Black History Week, which then later would become Black History Month. And you can tell this is a nice little comic about his life, but he started off, he was the child of former slaves, and he worked in the mines of West Virginia. So this is someone who certainly did not have an easy life, but was able to do quite well. And I think one reason he's called the father of Black history is, of course, because he comes up with Black History Week, and then that later becomes Black History Month. But also his importance is how he puts Black history on an institutional basis, right? Du Bois is important as a historian, but he basically just writes. When we think about history, I mean, Du Bois did a lot of stuff. I'm not trying to take anything away from him, but in terms of just history, he's mostly just a writer. Woodson does more. Like Du Bois, Woodson was a Harvard PhD in history. He was the second African American to receive a PhD from Harvard in history. And he published many books on African American history. So he's very similar to to Du Bois. He's a little bit different from what we've seen so far. In a sense, he's similar in some ways to George Washington Williams, you could say, because he wants to show the importance of African Americans within U.S. history. In a sense, he wants to integrate African Americans into U.S. history to say, you cannot understand U.S. history without understanding African Americans. Right? He wants to say, we're not just a sideline. We're at the heart with white Americans and other Americans in the story of U.S. history. Now, here's the thing, though. He realized that there was intense institutional racism in the United States. Now, this changed, of course, because Du Bois is later going to present a paper at the American Historical Association. But at first, even though Carter Woodson was a member of the American Historical Association, he couldn't attend the meetings because he was Black. He was excluded. And so he realized, if we want the story of African American history to get out there, if we want to challenge these racist understandings of American history, and if we want to show that African Americans are an important part of American history, we need to develop the institutional foundation to maintain studies in that area. So remember, we've been talking about how in the 19th and into the 20th century, you had the development of all these historical associations. You had the development of historical journals, development of conferences that are still with us today, right? That's the bedrock, the foundation of historical studies. Woodson wanted to do the same thing for African American history. So in 1915, he founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Right? We're going to have an association. We'll have conferences. We'll have meetings. We'll get together and talk about this. We'll bring historians together who are interested in quote unquote Negro life and history. Let's look at that together. And we can then develop our understanding of history better. And let's establish a journal. Right? And he helps establish the Journal of Negro History in 1916. He's the key leader in that, because that will allow a forum for research about African American history to be established, right? So I want to stress the way that historians typically work, right? Historians do research. We get together as part of conferences sponsored by associations, and we share our research, and we talk with each other, and then we develop it, and then we publish it. And then those publications eventually get turned into textbooks. And so in that way, what we historians do reaches out among average everyday people. They get taught it in school. And what Woodson is doing is by putting African American history on a foundation, an institutional foundation, he can make sure that it gets into the textbooks too. That it gets around and disseminated among the wider American population. All right, so he's key, and I think this is one reason why he's considered the father of Black history.